Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? They say murdered three. Strange things that happen here. How stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?
Welcome to Strange Things, broadcasting from the Arkanasa Radio Studios in Laredo, Texas. And welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. If you haven't done your Christmas shopping yet, well, you're getting kind of close to the last minute. I've just got one or two little tiny items I got to go out and find for handout gifts. I like to get my Christmas shopping done in November. Saves on having to fight with the crowds at the mall or at Sam's or waiting on packages from Amazon. Tonight, we're going to talk about Adolf Hitler. In a bad way. Tonight's show was requested by Dylan Von Winkle from up in Missouri. He wrote in asking if I would do a show about whether or not Hitler actually died in Berlin in 1945. To start right off, I don't want anybody to get the idea I am idolizing Hitler. He was an evil person who did a lot of nasty things. He was also the product of his environment, but not as if he was a victim. At that time, Jews were not exactly welcomed in a lot of places. He just carried it to an extreme. I hear the speculation from a lot of folks. If they had a time machine, and they were able to travel back in time, they would go back and kill Hitler. To begin with, this wouldn't have an effect on our world today because of timeline splits. Instead of changing the world we live in, the time traveler would create a different timeline, splitting off at the moment that he committed the deed. This wouldn't really change things as far as we were concerned. I think had Hitler never gained power in Germany, someone else would have clomb to the position of power, and things would have turned out about the same way. Had Kennedy not been killed in Dallas, he would have been killed someplace else, because this is how the world works. I don't believe in predestiny, but these super huge events have to happen, for whatever reason. I could be wrong. Maybe you could go back in time to, say, Leonding, Austria in 1894, track down a 5-year-old boy and kill him, if you could do such a thing. This would take Hitler out of our timeline. Maybe this would change the world we live in today. But what kind of change would this lead to? World War II might never have happened. All the people who died in the war would have survived. All the inventions brought out in an effort to win the war would never have left the drawing board. The Holocaust would not have happened, and Israel would not be a country today. Or it would all happen no matter what was done to prevent it, and some other maniacal dictator would have stepped into the void and led Germany into a world of death camps and genocide. Until a time traveler shows up and explains these things, we may never know. John Teeter did tell us a lot about his world that didn't match our world, but he vanished without ever actually proving he was from the future. So let's take a look at Hitler and try and find out, did he really kill himself? Or did he escape justice and live a long life after the war? First, there is a little history. Alois Schicklgruber was born in 1837 to a single mom. Back then, he was considered to be illegitimate. On his baptismal certificate, the name of the father was left blank, so Alois started out using his mother's last name, Schicklgruber. In 1842, Johann Georg Hitler married Alois's mother, Marie Anne. Alois was sent to live with Johann's brother. In 1876, Alois was adopted into the family, and the baptismal record was changed to show Johann Georg Hitler as Alois's father. The certificate was recorded in the country registry as George Hitler. Alois then began using the name Hitler as his last name. Back then, spelling was left up to whoever had the pen. The name Hitler was also spelled Heidler, Hutler, and Hitler. Many different spellings, many different pronunciations. It wasn't until 1906 that folks began to say certain words were to be spelled in certain ways. This is when the word like certain were to be spelled C-E-R-T-A-I-N. It sounds like it should start with an S instead of a C. Words were spelled certain ways so people would know how to spell them from then on. Whether they sounded the way they were spelled, well, that was another thing. You've probably heard the story that Hitler had a Jewish great-grandfather. I have heard this my entire life. It was based on the idea that Alois was fathered by a man named Leopold Frankenberger, who was the son of the family that employed Marie Schicklgruber. This also was supposed to have happened while she was working in Graz, Austria. A search of the records from Graz from the 1840s show no one named Frankenberg living in the entire district. This would make the story of Hitler having Jewish ancestors as being fiction, made up to muddy the waters of history's heritage. Maybe somebody in the Nazi Party was trying to throw dirt on their leader. Or, more than likely, it was war propaganda spread by the Allies. Adolf was born on April 20th, 1889, in Braunau am Inn, a town in Austria-Hungary, close to the border with German Empire. He was christened as Adolphus Hitler. There were 8 kids in the family, but several died at a young age. This was common back then. Nobody knew about childhood diseases. When he was 8, Hitler took to singing lessons, and he sang in the church choir. He began to consider becoming a priest after having spent so much time in the church. When his younger brother, Edmund, died, Adolf changed into a brooding, self-conscious teen. His dad was a nasty person who drank and beat everyone around him. His mother, on the other hand, was overly protective, which led to a kind of a weird environment for anybody to grow up in. Did you ever see the movie The Boys from Brazil in 1978? If not, you should watch it. The story goes, a bunch of boys were adopted by families all over the world, where the father is an older civil servant and the mother is overly doting. The hero, Ezra Lieberman, played by Laurence Olivier, begins to unravel the plot when he discovers that Dr. Joseph Mengele, played by Gregory Peck, has cloned Adolf Hitler. Cloning will give you an exact replica of the original, but the upbringing will lead to the child being different from the original. Mengele is trying to recreate Hitler's childhood in hopes of having a brand new Hitler to run the Fifth or Sixth Reich. The book was great, and the movie was worth watching. Check it out. It's called The Boys from Brazil. Alois died on January 3rd, 1903, which led to Hitler's performance at school to become even worse since he no longer even bothered to try. After a few months, his mother allowed him to drop out. Adolf did go back to school, and after several attempts, he managed to graduate. Once he was out, he had no idea what he wanted to do with his life. And no longer having a father, Adolf managed to get a scholarship to study fine art in Vienna, which was financed by the Orphans' Benefits in 1907. His mother helped pay the bills not covered by the scholarship. December 21st, 1907, his mother died at the age of 47. By 1909, Hitler had run out of money, and he was forced to live in a homeless shelter. He earned some money as a casual laborer and by painting and selling watercolors of the different Vienna sites. During his time in Vienna, he pursued a growing passion for architecture and music. Was Adolf a decent artist? Well, his teachers weren't impressed by his work. He could create some good pictures, but they didn't really catch the eye. These were the kinds of things you would buy copies of for about $10 at a home decorating store. Of 14 paintings, watercolors, and drawings by Adolf Hitler were auctioned in Nuremberg in 2015. They sold for $450,000. Not a huge fortune, but still not bad. Of course, I'll bet his name had more to do with the price than the artwork. In August 1914, at the outbreak of World War I, Hitler was living in Munich and voluntarily enlisted in the Bavarian army. Now, he was a citizen of Austria, not Bavaria. Adolf should have been told to go back to his home country and enlist there, but for unknown reasons he was allowed to join the Bavarian army. Austria, Hungary, Bavaria, Germany, Bulgaria, and Turkey were allies during the war, but each was its own country. The whole situation led up to the war is quite a mess, and I'll save it for some other time. Adolf served as a dispatch runner. Back then, communications were done either by field phone, that had to be connected by a wire, or direct contact. So if the lines were down, which they usually were, someone had to carry the orders to the front. Adolf would be handed a message, and then he would run to whoever it was meant for and hand off the note, and then carry a return message back to headquarters. Do you ever picture Hitler as being an athletic artist? He was decorated for bravery, receiving the Iron Cross Second Class in 1914. On a recommendation by Lieutenant Hugo Gutmann, Hitler's Jewish superior, he received the Iron Cross First Class on August 4th, 1918. It was unusual for a corporal to receive such a medal. Either Adolf was an outstanding soldier, or his boss really liked him. He received the Black Wound Badge on May 18, 1918, after being hit in the thigh by fragments from a shell in the Battle of the Somme. This was their equivalent of our Purple Heart. If you look at photos of Hitler, in several you'll see he has two decorations on his jacket. One is the Iron Cross and the other is the Wound Medal. During this time, there's no indication of any anti-Semitic ideas on Adolf's part. His commanding officer was Jewish. Adolf drew pictures and wrote about the war, but he never said or did anything showing any hatred of the Jews. Something like 100,000 German Jews and German Jewish military personnel served in the German army during World War I, of whom 12,000 were killed in action. The Iron Cross was awarded to 18,000 German Jews during the war. When I say the German army, I'm referring to all the countries allied with Germany. Austria, Turkey, Bavaria, even Romania, the whole bunch. On the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, 1918, Germany surrendered to the Allies. Those in charge really thought they could simply stop fighting and that would be that. Germany had no idea what was about to happen to them. The Treaty of Versailles said Germany and its allies were going to get to pay for the entire war. This, combined with a redesign of Europe, led to massive depression that drove the German regions into near total collapse. Workers would go to their jobs in the morning. They would be paid at noon. They insisted. Their wives would show up at the different job sites, take the money, run into town, and quickly spend it before the Reichsmark devaluated any farther. By evening, the money that they had been paid at noon was already worthless. People actually used the Reichsmark as wallpaper because that was about all it was worth. The Treaty of Versailles said Germany and its allies could only have a small military. And Adolf was desperate because he had no formal education and no family that he could rely on for support, and his only means of making a living was to stay in the army. With only 100,000 men, Adolf had to really struggle to find a spot in such a small unit. Having been awarded the Iron Cross twice and with recommendations from his superiors, Hitler was given one of the few slots available. He did have to take whichever assignments were handed him. In July 1919, Adolf was appointed as a Verbindungsmann, or intelligence agent, in the Aufklärungskommando, or reconnaissance unit. Even though my family is German, nobody in my family spoke a word of German. Originally, we were named Kessler, but that was a long time ago. His assignment, Adolf's assignment, was to infiltrate the German Workers' Party. The High Command was worried about the few soldiers they had being influenced by communists or socialists or other undesirables that were running around the country making life miserable for those in charge. The Treaty of Versailles said soldiers who were in the army could not be replaced until after they had served for 8 years. This was to keep the Germans from bringing in 100,000 soldiers, training them, and then sending them back out as civilians. This would have made for a massive civilian soldiers' army, like our National Guard. Hitler would attend meetings, and he would sit in the back and listen to the speakers who began to point the finger at who was responsible for losing the war. It was somebody else's fault, they said. It was those politicians. It was the international bankers. Or it just might have been the Jews. Hitler would write up a report at the end of each night and submit it to his superior officers in the military, and then the superior officers would decide whether or not the Workers' Party was a danger to the country or not. At the end of one of the meetings, Adolf was asked to stand up and give a statement on how he felt about things. Adolf was good at putting words together. He spoke with feeling, and it made those listening believe everything he said, whether he believed it or not. By the end of the night, Adolf was invited to join the Workers' Party. His party number was 555, which sounds like there were a lot of members, but they had actually started counting at 500. The Workers' Party became known as the National Socialist German Workers' Party, and from there it became the National Socialists, or Nazis. As the Nazi Party grew, they turned to violent tactics. The brown shirts, or the SA, would march through the streets and basically beat up anyone not a member of their party. You were either one of them or you're an enemy of Germany. The story of Hitler's rise to power will not fit into a one-hour show, but it was important to give his basic history. Hitler ran against Hindenburg in the 1932 presidential election, but the Nazi Party only received 35% of the vote. Hindenburg only got 45%. The last 20% was for the German Communist Party. In a bid to garner more support for his government, Hindenburg appointed Hitler as Chancellor of Germany. Hitler was never elected. He was appointed. Well, the brown shirts got busy sowing hate and dissension behind the scenes, trying to make Hindenburg look inept, which he pretty much was. Late at night on February 27, 1933, the brown shirts set fire to the German Reichstag, or the government building, and burned it to the ground. Well, this caused Hindenburg to pass a law suspending just about every civil right in the country. The brown shirts continued stirring things up until Hindenburg was forced to abdicate. Hitler, who promised he would continue to run the country in a democratic manner, was voted into office by the Reichstag, and he was pretty much handed total power. Both Hitler and the Nazi Party became the ruling party. The brown shirts were used as a means of gaining power. They consisted of just about every person that couldn't fit in anywhere else. They were the outcasts, the people that nobody else wanted, but they were accepted into the SA with welcome arms. Made them feel wanted. They were outside the Treaty of Versailles because they were not actually in the army, even though they wore uniforms and they carried weapons. Inside the brown shirts were a special group called the SA, or the Stormtroopers. This would morph into the SS. Once Hitler was in command, he sent out the SS to deal with the brown shirts. In other words, get rid of them. This was the July 1934 Night of the Long Knives. Somewhere around 700 to 1,000 people were killed in a purge that removed anyone Hitler thought might try to take over. All the top leaders of the brown shirts, as well as any politicians or union leaders, were killed. The SS didn't pledge their allegiance to Germany. They pledged their allegiance to Hitler. This made them an army of one man instead of a country. More than 800,000 soldiers were in the SS. These were the folks running the concentration camps. They were responsible for the killing of women and children and old men. They would round up thousands of people and systematically kill them. Fanatics and murderers given full authority to do as they pleased. If you saw the movie Fury, the guy with his arm in a sling, he was an SS officer, and that's why they shot him. Towards the end of the war, when everybody was scrambling, trying to stay alive and trying to not be arrested or killed, SS soldiers had all had their blood type tattooed on the inside of their left forearm. This way, if they needed a blood transfusion in the heat of battle, the blood type didn't have to be checked. All they had to do was look and see there was a blood type tattooed. Well, this tattoo was prima facie evidence of the person being an SS soldier, so the SS took great means to try to remove these tattoos. So then it became anyone with a scar on the inside of the left arm or a wound was suspected of being an SS officer and immediately arrested. At some point in the war, someone must have come to the conclusion that Germany just might lose this one as well. Germany was lacking in natural resources. A plan was put in place to escape justice should it become necessary. At the end of World War I, or the War to End All Wars, Europe and the Americas got busy celebrating. They celebrated right into the Great Depression. The people were focused on living their own lives and not looking for any nastiness. After all, the Treaty of Versailles made it impossible for a war like that to ever happen again. Germany was already planning World War II in the 30s. They built great big merchant ships that were pre-designed to become warships. They used Volkswagen cars to drive across fields where they would develop their plans for the Blitz. Airliners were designed to also handle paratroopers. There was no Air Force, but private planes were allowed, and these quickly became warplanes practically overnight. To outsiders, it looked as if Hitler was simply putting his people back to work and fixing their economy. To the insiders, it was a plan to take over all of Europe. Spain had fought their own civil war from 1936 to 1939. What had become as a military coup turned into a civil war. Half of the military tried to seize power. The government and the other half tried to keep control. Folks from all over the world flocked to Spain to fight fascism. A system of government marked by centralization of authority under a dictator, an economy subject to stringent government controls, violent suppression of opposition, and typically a policy of belligerent nationalism and racism. It was actually first conceived in Italy, but it was incorporated in Spain and Germany. The countries of Europe and the Americas considered the Civil War in Spain to be an internal struggle, and therefore they chose to stay out of it. They did sign an embargo agreement stating the countries would not support either side of the conflict. The League of Nations saw the war as being a battle to stop the spread of communism, so they tended to side with Franco's army. Russia began shipping in weapons to support the beleaguered Spanish government. The International Brigade was made up of people from all over the world who fought fascism using arms supplied by the Soviets. The National Socialists, or the Nazi government, liked what they saw in Franco's army. Hitler sent in the Luftwaffe and armored units to help Franco overthrow the elected government. This was an opportune time to test out new battle strategies and to see what kind of offensives worked best. Things like putting a siren on a Stuka dive bomber to instill more fear in people who might survive the bomb strike. Once Franco had won, he declared Spain was to be neutral in the next coming war. As a lead-up to World War II, Germany had placed huge weapons caches all over Spain. German ships were anchored in Spanish harbors filled with supplies for U-boats. There were German resorts in Spain so the military leaders could sit and relax during the war. Tons of gold and equipment were shipped to South America. Argentina was also a fascist government, and Hitler and his men were welcome there any time they chose to visit. Mexico had more than their share of German immigrants. Many were in the Mexican army. There were radio stations all along the coast used to send messages to and from U-boats and merchant raiders. Spies worked out of Mexico, crossing the border into the U.S. using Swiss passports. Even though Switzerland was neutral in World War II, they did a lot to support Hitler. Things like allowing trains to pass through the country filled with troops, as well as people en route to concentration camps. Weapons and armaments were also built in Switzerland during the war. And at that happy note, I am going to take a brief pause and drink some coffee and play a couple of commercials. Don't go away, we'll be right back after this. You're listening to Arkanasa Radio. Did you hear a bump in the night and you think it just might be a ghost? Contact the Laredo Paranormal Research Society at laredoparanormal@hotmail.com. That's the LPRS for all your otherworldly needs. Did you go out UFO hunting and couldn't focus on the sky? Swing on by Del Norte Optical, 107 Calle Del Norte, right across from the Embassy Suites. That's not a weather balloon, that's a flying saucer. Back in 1776, someone said, "Give me coffee or give me death." And if that's how you feel, you should be at the Organic Man Coffee Truck. They make coffee the right way, one delicious cup at a time. 4501 McPherson, Suite number 9. Coffee, the stuff dreams are made of. Makeup isn't something you want to just smear on and hope for the best. You might come out looking like Lon Chaney. Call Lourdes James, independent beauty consultant, and get a free makeover to see how makeup should be done. 956-723-3019.
I want a hippopotamus for Christmas.
And welcome back to the show. This is Chris James again. Just a side note, Since I haven't become independently wealthy yet, if for some strange reason you have a hankering to help support the show, check out my books at Amazon.com. I highly recommend the Laredo Paranormal Research Society, which is the history of the local ghost investigating team. You can also find Strange Things with Chris James, the first and second year of the show. I took all the show notes and I turned them each into a book. You can buy a book and the money will help pay for things like my archives, which I just had to pay, and now I got to go back out and earn a little more money so I can buy those last 2 or 3 Christmas presents. Just if you feel like it. The people living in Germany had supported Hitler because he was making their lives better. Now, better as long as you weren't Jewish. The treaty had destroyed the country, and now Hitler was fixing the problems that came about because of those other countries. Once the United States got involved and the bombing raids began to take out just about every major city, and the citizens of Germany soon realized the war was not going their way. All they could hope for was a quick end to the war and a less nasty treaty to come out this time. The Nazis had no intention of surrendering. It wasn't something they even talked about. You'd get shot if you did. Not only would they shoot you, they'd put your entire family in a death camp as well. This brings to mind one of the most interesting characters to fight on either side of the war. I'm referring to the Star of Africa, Hans Hakim Martial. Okay, I know the name is French, but he was German. Way back in the 1600s, the Huguenots were chased out of France, and they wound up in Germany. Well, Hans started out as one of the worst German pilots in the entire war. He crashed every plane he was ever assigned to. The commanders would transfer him back and forth as a means of paying off debts to each other. You owe me, so you got to take him. That sort of thing. Nobody wanted him because he was doing a better job of destroying German planes than the British. And then something clicked. He had 158 victories. That means he shot down 158 airplanes. No one ever came even close to his abilities. Surprisingly, any time an enemy pilot was captured, Hans would insist on having dinner with them. They would talk late into the night about anything but fighting. You see, Hans spoke English as well as German and French, and I think he spoke Italian too. Hans loved to listen to U.S. music. Jazz and the blues were his favorites. He had a servant that was actually a captured British conscript soldier. Knowing the man would have faced harsh treatment in a German POW camp, Hans took the soldier in as his personal assistant. Matthias Letulu was a South African who was drafted into the British military. Hans refused to send the black man on to the POW camp. Matthias became a close friend of the German ace. On several occasions when a pilot was injured after either crashing or bailing out, Hans would fly over the enemy airstrip, even though everyone at the airstrip was shooting at him, and he would drop a message telling what had become of the pilot. He did this so often his commanding officer stopped trying to get him to quit. Hans felt it was the proper thing to do to let the friends and the family know what had become of the pilot. When he would return from a mission, the mechanics would rearm the plane for the next mission. They soon discovered that Hans had the absolute lowest expenditure of ammo. He would fire 10 or 15 rounds for every plane he shot down. For being so good at what he didn't like fighting. Anytime Hans went on leave, his buddies would have to go and find him once he'd gone AWOL, which he did just about every time. He never came back under his own power. If he was on leave, his buddies had to go find him. Hans was shocked when he found out what was happening to the Jews, and he said so on many occasions. He also insulted Hermann Göring during an awards celebration, saying the guy was way too fat, which he was. They didn't call him Fat Herman just to spite him. It probably had something to do with his flirting with the wife of industrialist Messerschmitt. He had an affair with both Messerschmitt's wife and daughter, which probably led to his demise. Okay, he was doing a lot more than flirting. A lot more. Hans was issued a brand new Messerschmitt airplane. Not too conspicuous. The paint had barely dried on the victory markings on the tail when Hans had engine trouble. The engine began to fall apart and it seized up in midair. Hans tried to bail out, but was hit by the tail fin of his plane. September 30th, 1942, Hans Marcial died at the age of 22. This just goes to show the Germans were not the problem. It was the Nazis. I really believe they had him killed. If you want to know more about Hans Marcial, you can read the book, The Star of Africa. It's well worth your time. With bombing missions going on day and night, Hitler was finding it difficult to get a good night's sleep. So he had soundproofed bunkers built in Berlin. A soundproof is important to keep in mind. These bunkers were also huge and built using the same set of blueprints. They could withstand direct hit by just about anything the Allies had. And did I mention they were soundproof? Okay, I'll get to that in a second. April 20th, his 56th birthday, Hitler made his last trip from the Führer bunker. He handed out a few medals to the kids that were going to die to keep him safe. Then he went in and shut the doors. May 2nd, 1945, President Dönitz, who had become commander of Germany on April 29th, 1945, surrendered to the Allies. The war in Europe was over. The United States, Britain, and Russia began to divvy up Berlin in order to run things. The British didn't much like the Soviets, and so they worked with the U.S. kind of against them. Look at any photos from World War II where Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin are together. Roosevelt is always between the other two. Churchill hated Stalin, and Stalin didn't trust Churchill. At some point after the war, Stalin began to suspect that Churchill had gotten a hold of Hitler and was keeping him safely in custody. Stalin sent word to England demanding Hitler be turned over to the Soviet army for trial and execution. Churchill didn't much care for receiving these complaints. Day after day, the same thing. Stalin just knew that Churchill had Hitler and he'd better turn him over or else. Churchill told the army to do something, anything, to get Stalin to shut up and go away. This was an order, and the British Army was all about following orders, so they sent Major Oughton from England to Germany to take care of this problem. The trouble with Major Oten was he didn't speak German. He could read encrypted messages in German, but he could not speak to anyone in the language. Another problem with Major Oten was he wasn't a field investigator. His duties had been behind a desk the entire war. So why was this major sent to Germany to do something to shut Stalin up? Actually, Major Oten didn't even exist. This was the name used by Major Hugh Trevor Roper, who served in the Radio Security Service of the Secret Intelligence Service. He was a radio operator. Major Oten, or Roper, got busy questioning Germans. He got a hold of the guard who was stationed at the door to Hitler's bunker. The guard said, or is supposed to have said, that he heard a shot from inside the bunker, inside a soundproof bunker. He went inside and he found Hitler and Eva Braun dead from poison and a gunshot wound. He heard this through a soundproof door. When asked about the bodies, Roper said he was told that the guards gathered up Hitler and Eva, carried their bodies outside, placed them in a ditch, and set them on fire. All that remained was some bones and a bit of clothing. So Roper went and got Adolf and Eva's dental records. He got a hold of their dentist. Well, not really the dentist. He got a hold of a dental assistant to identify the bodies. The dental assistant drew up a set of dental records from memory, and this was used to ID the bodies. I'd really like to know why that phone rings every time I'm in the middle of a show. Somebody's listening, and they wait till the middle of the show, and then they call. No, that would be too conspicuous leaning. Anyway. These dental records that were hand-drawn by an assistant who spent most of his time sitting behind a desk looking at records had no idea what Hitler and Eva Braun's dental records should have looked like, but he drew them from memory. The Soviets had found some burned bodies outside the bunker, and they just assumed these were Hitler and Eva. They secreted the remains away in a grave. Later, they dug up the body parts, reburied them someplace else. Later still, the bones were dug up once more and then shipped off to Moscow. Major Roper had one specialty when it came to his career in the military. He knew a good work of fiction when he read one, or wrote it, as this turns out. Roper was a history major and a classics professor in college. Major Roper wrote up his official report saying that Eva Braun and Adolf Hitler had committed suicide, and that was that. He sent it off to London. From there, it was forwarded to Stalin, telling him to knock it off. Hitler was dead, and so there was nothing to be done about it. Next thing you know, the story's on the front page of every newspaper. Hitler is dead. We can now get on with defeating Japan, and then peace on earth forever. So how could Hitler have escaped from a city that was surrounded on all sides by the Allies? Oh, there were lots of ways for him and his new wife to escape. Hannah Reich was a female test pilot in the Luftwaffe. She was known as the best pilot in all of Germany, but she never flew in combat. The Soviets had entire squadrons of female combat pilots, but Germany was not having any of this. It was okay to gas them, but women were not allowed to fight. On April 26, 1945, Hannah flew into Berlin and landed at the zoo. All the streets in Berlin had all been built wide enough and long enough to accommodate planes. After spending some time visiting with Hitler in the bunker, Hannah clomb back into her plane and flew away. She claims she was alone in the cockpit. Full-blown Nazi, sworn to protect Hitler at all costs. I believe her. Well, not really. The plane she flew, the Storch, was the same model used in Operation Ike in 1943 when German commandos rescued deposed Italian dictator Benito Mussolini from a mountaintop near the Gran Sasso. Are we to believe that the Germans would go to the trouble to rescue a dictator Hitler didn't even like and not consider doing the same thing for him? The bunker where Hitler was last seen wound up in the Soviet side of Berlin. The Soviet army blew it up, not wanting anyone to have a shrine to Hitler. Well, an examination of the second bunker in Berlin, the same design and everything, shows there was a second entrance, or exit, depending on which way you were going. If the bunker had a second way in and out, then Hitler could have walked out the back door and slipped into the sewer system. Would you believe the sewers in Berlin were built big enough you could drive a truck through them? The idea was, in case of really bad weather or trouble, say you're being overrun by the Soviet army, you could drive away in relative safely, since the sewers were dozens of feet below the streets. The sewers would have taken Hitler right to the front door of Brandenburg Airfield. Even this late in the war, the airfield was still serviceable. Several planes flew out from Brandenburg Airfield loaded with luggage in late April 1945. Not people, just bags filled with clothes and personal effects of Eva and Adolf Hitler. Yes, they had finally gotten married towards the end of the April. Why would Hitler send his clothes off to the country if he didn't plan on joining them? It's over 1,000 miles from Berlin, Germany to Madrid, Spain. This was manageable at the time by passenger planes. It was rarely done because of the cost in fuel. But if you're the head honcho of the entire country, it not only could be done, but it would be done. Hitler and Eva could have flown into Spain with very little difficulty. Hitler was known for flying all over Germany even before becoming dictator. Once in Spain, all he'd have to do is lay low for a bit until arrangements could be made to ship him out. Once Germany had surrendered, the Navy pretty much ceased patrolling operations in the Atlantic. All of their attention was now being focused on Japan. A German U-boat Type 21 was able to sail 17,000 miles without refueling. It was equipped with all of the latest electronic gadgets, and it had a diesel-electric motor. It also incorporated a snorkel that ran from the diesel engine to allow fresh air into the ship and to pump the diesel waste out. Germany built 1,250 U-boats during World War II. Of these, there are still over 40 that are unaccounted for. When Admiral Dönitz surrendered, he surrendered all of the German resources as well. The Army, Navy, and Air Force were no longer at war. So why did several U-boats continue sailing all the way to South America before turning themselves in? Once the war was over, if you were a soldier or sailor or an airman, you were done. As long as you weren't a criminal, you had nothing to lose or gain by continuing to do your duty. The only people who didn't surrender were the Nazis. The SS had big problems explaining what they'd done to all those people in all those concentration camps. Himmler tried to disguise himself as an infantryman. Those who didn't try to sneak out of the country chose to commit suicide, knowing they would face trial and execution once found. Many managed to escape to Argentina, where gold had been sent since the earliest parts of the war to pave the way for an escape should it be necessary. A Luftwaffe pilot, Peter Baumgart, claimed that he had personally flown Hitler to Denmark on April 30th, 1945. Baumgart later checked himself into an insane asylum and then stopped saying he had aided Hitler's escape. Was he lying the first time or the second time? Did somebody tell him to stop, or did he see the writing on the wall? Even with the surrender of Germany, the Nazis were still running around, and they were still just as fanatical as ever. A declassified FBI document from 1945 said there was a real possibility that Adolf Hitler was alive and well in South America. It stated the story of Hitler's suicide was made up to take pressure off the military at the end of the war. There were no witnesses who had come forward saying they had seen Hitler. There were witnesses who came forward saying that they had seen Hitler in Spain in May of 1945, long after he was supposed to have committed suicide. Then there were witnesses who said they'd seen someone who looked exactly like Hitler in Argentina. July 29, 1945, an informant gave an interview to the Los Angeles Examiner about having seen Hitler landing in Argentina. The story was not published in the newspapers since Hitler was dead, and so the witness had to have been wrong. The witness was a fisherman who had been working near the coast when a U-boat surfaced. A crew rowed a boat into shore with 2 passengers aboard. One was a female, and the other was a man who everyone was either helping out or extremely focused on. A witness went to the Federal Bureau of Investigations and provided them with information that 2 German submarines, one with Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun on board, landed along the tip of the Valdez Peninsula in the Gulf of San Vitias in Argentina. The informant was one of the 4 men who had met the submarine, and he had been paid $15,000 to assist Hitler's party. He provided the information in exchange for political asylum in the United States. 1945, the U.S. Naval Attaché in Buenos Aires informed Washington that there was a high probability that Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun had just arrived in Argentina. His report coincided accurately with the sighting of the U-530 submarine, which was the boat supposed to be carrying Hitler. Later, future President, but then General Dwight D. Eisenhower, told the Stars and Stripes newspaper he believed there was a real possibility that Hitler was living safely and comfortably in Argentina. Colonel W.J. Heimlich, chief of the U.S. intelligence in Berlin, concluded, "There is no evidence beyond that of hearsay to support the theory of Hitler's suicide. On the basis of present evidence, no insurance company in America would pay a claim on Adolf Hitler." Why would Hitler kill himself? I don't think he ever considered losing his life, let alone the war. For years, money had been shipped out of Germany and into other countries. If Hitler was going to go down with the ship, he wouldn't have sent so many resources out of town. That and equipment that was shipped to South and stashed away. It wasn't there for the locals to use trying to take over the world. Only the Nazis would have made arrangements to make a run for it, leaving the Germans to pay the price of the war. When the first concentration camp was found, the world began calling for all of Germany to pay for what the SS had done. German POWs here in the United States were suddenly treated as if they were war criminals and all those concentration camps had been their fault. Meanwhile, all over South America, neighborhoods cropped up with nothing but German inhabitants, thousands of them. Otto Adolf Eichmann was an SS lieutenant colonel. Eichmann was the head guy responsible for rounding up Jews and sending them to their death. In 1945, he escaped to South America and took up residence in Argentina. A Nazi hunter, Simon Wiesenthal, received a letter from a Jewish couple who had seen Eichmann while on vacation in Argentina. Wiesenthal passed this on to the Mossad, the Israeli intelligence service, who located Eichmann using extreme clandestine operations. They started a plan to capture the war criminal and bring him to justice. The agents waited on a side street for Eichmann to walk home from his job. When the man was right next to the rented car, the team jumped out and grabbed the Nazi and drove him to a house that they had rented. It was safe for operations. Once they were sure they had their man, the Mossad had to get him out of Argentina, which was going to be difficult since the Argentine government was known for their relations with Nazi Germany. The agents dressed Eichmann in a flight attendant's uniform, and then they drugged him into unconsciousness. The team, then dressed in the same uniforms, drove to the airport, arriving late at night and acting as if they had all been drinking. When Eichmann was checked by the Argentinian officials, his passport showed a photograph of the unconscious man, and it stated that he was part of the crew. The Mossad operatives told the official their fellow flight crewman had had too much to drink and he had passed out. Once on board the plane, Eichmann was secured and the plane took off en route for Israel. Once the war criminal was out of Argentina and word got back to them, the Argentine government went to the United Nations and lodged a complaint. The UN told Israel that they had violated Argentinian sovereignty. Israel said, "Sorry, but no, you can't have him back." Eichmann was going to stand trial. Israel allowed a lawyer from Germany to come to their country in order to represent Eichmann. The trial was far fairer than anything any Jew Eichmann had sent to their deaths ever received. Eichmann was found guilty and sentenced to death. The thing about Israeli executions is they never happen. Anyone found guilty and sentenced to death would automatically have their sentence commuted to life in prison by an appeals court, a group of judges who would meet the next day. This was done automatically. In Eichmann's case, the judges never got together to commute his sentence. On June 1st, 1962, Otto Adolf Eichmann was the guest of honor at a necktie party. The Israelis were a lot nicer to him than he had ever been to any of his prisoners. Well, Argentina immediately severed all relations with Israel over the incident. Nazi war criminals received an extra bit of protection after this. The CIA were not happy about this either. They had known of Eichmann's whereabouts for years, but they never passed on the intel to Israel because they thought they could use the intel for their own purposes. This wasn't necessarily the United States' purposes, only the CIA's. Joseph Mengele, also known as the Angel of Death, also escaped to Argentina. Once there, he got a job working for his family firm, selling farming equipment. 1956, Mengele received a passport in his real name, which he used to travel back and forth to Germany to visit his family and conduct business. Mengele died 1976 after suffering a stroke. Those who knew him also knew he had been a high-ranking SS officer and was wanted for war crimes. No one turned him in because they preferred the Nazis to the Jews. There were many more Nazis living and thriving in Argentina, but no one was much interested in rounding them up. If all these underlings could get to Argentina and live their lives after what they had done, why not the head of the snake as well? Adolf Hitler would have had a much easier time getting out of Germany and would have been treated like royalty once he was in his new home. The folks doing the TV show Hunting Hitler found all kinds of buildings hidden away in the hills and woods out in the back parts of Argentina. They also interviewed many witnesses who all said they had seen Hitler in Argentina long after the war. Just what might have been the plan once they arrived in their new home? How about the Fourth Reich? The Nazis got busy putting together their next try at world domination. But shooting and bombing hadn't worked out so well. How about influencing political parties to do their bidding instead? Sneak Nazis into various political parties and get them into positions of power so they could influence world events without all the blowing things up and killing people. Argentina had what was known as the Dirty War, which ran from 1976 until 1983. This was a 7-year campaign by the Argentine government against suspected dissidents and subversives. Many people, both opponents of the government as well as innocent people, were disappeared in the middle of the night. This was the same tactics used by the Nazis in the 30s. In 2009, Nicholas Beltoni, an archaeologist from Connecticut, was allowed to perform DNA tests on a skull fragments the Soviets had found outside the Hitler bunker in 1945. The skull was the only piece of the two bodies that survived being burned and then buried and then dug up and buried again and then dug up once more and shipped to Moscow. A DNA test showed the skull did not belong to Hitler or Eva. The Soviet soldiers had grabbed any old skull littering the streets of Berlin in 1945, and they said, "Aha, we've got Hitler's body." What entity is there out there that just might be an offshoot of the Nazis? Is there an organization that goes after Israel and the Jews on every occasion, and they try to do away with them? Is there a group of people all trying to unite the world under one huge, unmanageable governing body known as the New World Order? How about the UN? The UN condemns Israel every time Israel does anything. Then the Palestinians send hundreds of missiles into Israel, and the UN doesn't say a word. Doesn't this seem just a tiny bit lopsided? Whether you like Israel or not, you have to admit the UN does nothing for them. You'd almost think that somebody at the UN wanted to kill all the Jews, just like the Nazis. I smell a rat. And now back to Adolf Hitler. Where did he wind up? And when did he die? Will we ever know for sure? Someone out there, maybe several someones, knows where Adolf is right now. He would be 129 years old. I'm fairly sure he's Kaputski. I'm fairly sure. What worries me is, what if he had a son, or even a daughter, who is now the new head of the Nazis all over the world? Fanatics would go to any length to put this descendant in a position of power to fulfill Adolf's vision. Germany overall. Did Adolf Hitler commit suicide at the end of 1945? I don't think so. I do believe that Hitler escaped from Germany, probably aided by various members of different organizations. I'm sure that he made it to South America, where he lived to a ripe old age before finally dying in bed. I hope this fulfills Dylan Van Winkle's wish for a show. If not, let me know and I'll try again. If you have something you'd like to hear about, send me a note at strangethings@arkanasa.com. You can catch the archives at YouTube, but you have to spell out the whole name, or you wind up getting Stranger Things. I had the name first. 2 whole months. There are still a lot of shows to be found at strangethings.podomatic.com as well. Till next Saturday, when we will be doing our annual Christmas show. Yes, me and my wife will be doing the Christmas show once again. Hopefully it will be entertaining and informative. Till next Saturday, this is Chris James.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man, the same murder 3? Strange things that happen here, how stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?